The Americas were the final continent to be settled by mankind. A growing collection of archaeological and genetic evidence points to a complex colonization process. This is especially true in South America, where unexpected ancestral signals have led to puzzling possibilities for early migrations across the continent. To add to the existing complexities, researchers discovered Denisovan and Neanderthal ancestry in ancient Peruvians. Who were these people who built thriving civilization in harsh, high-altitude environments? The ancient city of Tiwanaku, nestled in the high Andes of modern-day Bolivia, stands as a testament to one of the most remarkable pre-Columbian civilizations in South America. The builders of Tiwanaku constructed monumental stone structures, such as the Gateway of the Sun, at an elevation of 3,850 meters, roughly 12,631 feet, above sea level. The Tiwanaku civilization emerged in a region long inhabited by Andean Highlanders, whose genetic history stretches back at least 9,000 years. A pivotal study published in 2020 analyzed ancient DNA from 89 individuals across the Andes, including samples from the central Andes highlands of Peru dating to 9,000 years ago. Sites like Loricocha and Soromicaya Pacha provided some of the oldest DNA, revealing a deep genetic continuity among highland populations. The builders of Tiwanaku, who lived much later, are believed to be direct descendants of these early highlanders, as the study found minimal population replacement despite cultural shifts over millennia. What does this genetic continuity mean for our understanding of Tiwanaku's builders? The study showed that the highlanders who lived 9,000 years ago were already genetically distinct from coastal groups, a divergence driven by the ecological barrier of the Andes. By the time Tiwanaku rose to prominence, its people had inherited a genetic makeup finely tuned to the highland environment. Another study analyzed ancient DNA from 167 individuals across the Andes, including highlanders from the Tiwanaku period. These individuals showed strong genetic ties to earlier highland populations, with only minor gene flow from coastal and Amazonian groups, likely introduced during the later Inca period through resettlement policies. The ancient DNA of Andean Highlanders also reveals connections to archaic human populations, such as Denisovans and Neanderthals, which influenced traits like facial morphology. A 2021 study in Science Advances identified a Denisovan haplotype that affects lip thickness in modern Native Americans, a trait likely present in Tiwanaku's builders, given their predominantly Native American ancestry. Recent advances in ancient DNA analysis, combined with studies on Denisovan and Neanderthal introgression, offer unprecedented insights into the builders of Tiwanaku. By exploring their genetic adaptations, we can uncover the biological and evolutionary story behind their remarkable resilience and cultural achievements. Geneticists studied 3 Andean fossils discovered in Peru's highlands area. It's incredible that Denisovan and Neanderthal ancestry spread all the way to South America. The mixing must have occurred a long time ago, possibly 40,000 years. The fact that the lineage lasted and its genetic signal was found in 3 ancient Peruvian people shows that there was a major mixing event between humans and Denisovans in East Asia. Interestingly, the 3 samples had significant amounts of Denisovan ancestry, which is unusual except in Papua and Australia, while they also had similar levels of Neanderthal DNA to most Eurasians, around 2%. Similarly, a new study in communications biology found a Neanderthal introgressed haplotype in the region associated with increased nasal height in a Latin American population with significant Native American ancestry. Since the Tiwanaku builders share this ancestry, these archaic contributions may have shaped their facial features, particularly their noses and lips, which we'll explore later. Living at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, the builders of Tiwanaku faced a formidable challenge: hypoxia, or low oxygen availability. How did they survive and even thrive in such conditions? Ancient DNA studies provide clues about the genetic adaptations that enabled their resilience, adaptations that were already present in their ancestors 9,000 years ago. A study in Scientific Reports, which analyzed DNA from 109 Andean Highlanders spanning the last 8,500 years, identified several genes under positive selection for hypoxia response. One important gene, EPAS1, regulates the body's response to low oxygen levels. Unlike Tibetans, who inherited a Denisovan-derived variant, Andean Highlanders developed their own variants through natural selection. The 2020 study confirmed that these variants were present in highlanders as early as 9,000 years ago, suggesting that the ancestors of the Tiwanaku builders were already adapted to high-altitude living long before the city was built. What other genetic changes helped these Andes highlanders? Other genes, also involved in oxygen regulation, showed signs of selection in ancient samples. These genes likely enhanced oxygen delivery to tissues without the excessive red blood cell production seen in other high-altitude populations, a trait that persists in modern Andean populations, like the Quechua and Aymara, who are genetic descendants of the Tiwanaku builders. The study noted that this adaptation differs from Tibetans, who rely on increased oxygen saturation and have different hypoxia-related genes. Why did the Andean Highlanders evolve a unique genetic strategy? The answer may lie in their long isolation in the Andes, which allowed for localized selection pressures to shape their genome over millennia. Beyond this, the Tiwanaku builders adapted to a diet dominated by starchy crops like potatoes and quinoa, which were domesticated in the Andes around 5,000 years ago. Another study in Nature Communications found that modern Andean highlanders have a higher number of the genes which aids in starch digestion. Ancient DNA from 7,000-year-old highlanders, as analyzed in the 2020 science study, suggests this adaptation began early, likely aiding the Tiwanaku builders in sustaining their energy needs in a harsh environment. Another recent study on 5,000-year-old ancient DNA from Peru further confirmed that highlanders consumed these crops, supporting the genetic evidence of dietary adaptation. How did they adapt to high-altitude living, and what can their facial features, particularly their noses, lips, and face shapes, tell us about their genetic heritage? The shape of the nose is a critical trait in high-altitude environments where cold, dry air can stress the respiratory system. How did the builders of Tiwanaku adapt their nasal morphology to their environment, and what role did Neanderthal DNA play? The communications biology study provides a fascinating clue. A Neanderthal introgressed haplotype associated with increased mid-face height and nasal height in a population with significant Native American ancestry. This Neanderthal haplotype, present in up to 31% of chromosomes tested, mostly on a Native American background, likely influenced the nasal morphology of the Tiwanaku builders. The study compared modern nasal measurements with Neanderthal skulls, finding that the introgressed haplotype correlates with a taller nasal aperture, a feature typical of Neanderthals. But why might this trait have been advantageous in the Andes? A taller nasal cavity can warm and humidify cold, dry air more effectively, reducing respiratory stress at high altitudes. The 2020 study supports this idea, noting that early highlanders diverged genetically from coastal groups 9,000 years ago, possibly due to selection pressures like climate and altitude. Since the Tiwanaku builders share this Native American ancestry, they likely inherited this Neanderthal haplotype, which may have contributed to their nasal height. The ancient genomes of Tianyan man from China, Ustishim man from western Siberia, and Kostenki 14 from European Russia, three of the oldest human genomes all dating to around 40,000 years ago, also contain Neanderthal introgressed DNA in regions associated with high elevation adaptation, nose shape, and potentially lip shape. Other Neanderthal alleles suggest that these early modern humans carried introgressed DNA that may have contributed to hypoxia response, providing a foundation for later high-altitude adaptations in populations like the Andean Highlanders. Though not directly related to Native Americans, they share the same ancestors. The Neanderthal haplotype linked to increased nasal height is present in all three genomes, indicating that these individuals likely had taller nasal cavities, a trait advantageous for high-altitude living, and later observed in Andean populations. Neanderthal introgression in the region, while not directly linked to the Denisovan haplotype for lip thickness, suggests early modern humans had archaic DNA in this region, potentially influencing facial morphology in ways that overlapped with Denisovan contributions in later populations. These findings highlight the role of Neanderthal introgression in shaping traits relevant to high-altitude living and facial morphology, traits that may have been further selected for in the ancestors of the Tiwanaku builders. However, the exact impact on Tiwanaku individuals remains speculative, as no direct facial reconstructions or nasal measurements from their remains are available in the studies cited. Lip morphology, particularly thickness, is another facial trait influenced by archaic introgression. The Science Advances study identified a Denisovan haplotype that affects lip thickness in Native Americans. This haplotype, present in 34% of the samples, increases upper lip protrusion and lip thickness ratio while reducing lower lip thickness. Given the genetic continuity of Andean Highlanders, the Tiwanaku builders likely carried this Denisovan DNA, shaping their lip morphology. Why might thicker lips have been advantageous at high altitudes? One hypothesis proposed in the study links this trait to cold adaptation. Thicker lips and increased facial fat could have provided insulation against the frigid Andean climate. The study notes that this region shows signs of positive selection, possibly driven by environmental pressures like cold temperatures, which were significant at 3,850 meters elevation. The 2020 study supports this idea, as early Highlanders showed genetic adaptations to cold stress, such as variants in genes related to thermogenesis. Could lip thickness also have played a role in social or cultural practices? While genetic data points to a functional adaptation, the cultural significance of lip morphology in Tiwanaku society remains unknown. The builders' interactions with neighboring groups, as evidenced by minor gene flow in the 2018 Science Advances study, might have introduced additional variation in facial traits, but the Denisovan haplotype's prevalence suggests a strong archaic influence on their lip shape. The overall face shape of the Tiwanaku builders, beyond noses and lips, reflects a complex interplay of genetic and environmental factors. The communications biology study also identified other gene variants associated with facial morphology, such as chin dimples and forehead shape, but these were not directly linked to archaic introgression in the Andes. Nonetheless, the Neanderthal haplotype's effect on mid-face height likely contributed to a broader, more prominent mid-face, a trait often seen in high-altitude populations. The 2020 study provides context for understanding face shape evolution in the Andes. The genetic divergence between highland and coastal groups 9,000 years ago suggests that selection pressures, including altitude and climate, shaped facial features over time. High-altitude populations often exhibit wider faces and larger nasal cavities, adaptations that improve oxygen intake and protect against cold stress. While direct measurements of Tiwanaku skulls are not detailed in the cited studies, the genetic data implies that their face shape was optimized for their environment, with archaic DNA playing a supporting role. The genetic data aligns with archaeological evidence of the Tiwanaku builders' lifestyle. They were skilled farmers and pastoralists, cultivating potatoes, quinoa and coca, and herding llamas and alpacas. The 2022 study confirmed their reliance on domesticated crops, supporting the genetic evidence of adaptation. Their monumental architecture, such as the precisely cut stones of the Kalasasaya temple, reflects a sophisticated society with advanced engineering skills, likely supported by their physical resilience to the highland environment. What drove their cultural achievements? The genetic continuity observed in the 2020 study suggests that the Tiwanaku builders inherited not only biological adaptations, but also a cultural legacy of innovation from their ancestors. Their ability to thrive at high altitude, as evidenced by their hypoxia and dietary adaptations, allowed them to sustain a large population, estimated at 40,000 people at Tiwanaku's peak, supporting the labor-intensive construction of their city. The influence of Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA on the Tiwanaku builders raises intriguing questions about human evolution. How much of their success can be attributed to these archaic contributions? The Neanderthal haplotype, enhancing nasal height, and the Denisovan haplotype affecting lip thickness suggest that introgression provided adaptive advantages in the Andes. However, the 2020 science study emphasizes that local selection pressures, acting over millennia, were the primary drivers of their high-altitude adaptations. Today, modern Andean populations like the Quechua and Aymara carry the genetic legacy of the Tiwanaku builders, including these archaic haplotypes. Studies like the 2023 communications biology analysis show that these traits persist, influencing nasal and lip morphology in contemporary Latin Americans. This continuity underscores the enduring impact of ancient adaptations on modern populations, offering a bridge between past and present. The builders of Tiwanaku were a people shaped by their environment and their ancient genetic heritage. Ancient DNA reveals a 9,000-year history of genetic continuity in the Andes, with adaptations for high-altitude living that enabled them to thrive at 3,850 meters. Their noses, likely taller due to Neanderthal introgression, and their lips, thickened by Denisovan DNA, reflect both functional adaptations and the influence of archaic humans. These traits, combined with broader face shape changes, highlight the complex interplay of genetics and environment in their evolution. Lastly, another new study found that around 9,000 years ago, populations residing in the Andean Highlands had become genetically distinct from those who later settled along the Pacific coast. The consequences of this early divergence are still evident today. The genetic fingerprints that separate people living in the highlands from those in other regions are remarkably ancient. Given the short distance, this is exceptional. The scientists discovered that by 5,800 years ago, the northern Andes population had established separate genetic signatures from the ones that became prevalent in the south. Again, these distinctions can still be seen today. Following then, gene flow occurred throughout the Andes, albeit it reduced significantly after 2,000 years ago, according to the scientists. The Tiwanaku culture lived in huge metropolitan centers, which were two exceptions to the continuity tendency. Indeed, rather than being fairly genetically homogeneous, the capital regions of these civilizations were cosmopolitan, hosting people from many genetic backgrounds. The genetic evidence show early genetic differences between groups in surrounding locations, population mixing inside and outside the Andes, astonishing genetic continuity despite cultural upheaval, and ancestral cosmopolitanism among some of the region's most well-known ancient civilizations. What can we learn from the Tiwanaku builders today? Their story is a testament to human resilience, showing how genetic adaptations and cultural innovation can overcome even the harshest conditions. As we continue to study ancient DNA, we may uncover more about their lives, their appearances, and the secrets of their monumental city, deepening our appreciation for the Andean Highlanders who built one of the ancient world's most enduring legacies. Nevertheless, the great majority of published ancient DNA studies to date have focused on Western Eurasia. This study in South America allows us to begin to discern at high resolution the detailed history of human movements in this extraordinarily important part of the world.